Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Let me first welcome all the new subscribers and say a quick hello and thank you to all of our loyal listeners. Today, we continue with the Darlie Routier trial, and we've moved on to a new witness. Now, here is what happened. We are on part 2 of this new witness. But let's quickly recap what happened in the previous episode. In the last episode, we heard from Alan Brantley, an FBI agent that was brought in by the prosecution to testify. But we haven't yet quite gotten to his testimony. Instead, this seemed to be a surprise for the defense, and they learned that this witness had access to various documents and images that the defense team had not even seen before. Now, the defense, they needed time, obviously, to review this information, and they were given by the judge 45 minutes. After this, the defense argued about whether or not this guy can testify at all and references certain legal items, including various rules and other court rulings, such as the Daubert standard and the Robinson standard. After laying out these rules and bringing all of this to the judge's attention, the judge still allowed him to testify. The files and the photographs that he had in his possession contained crucial new information. And as I mentioned earlier, this could potentially infringe upon the defendant's right to a fair trial, given the limited, very, very limited time that the defense had to review this information. Quite frankly, it just didn't seem fair. This situation could lead to the defense objecting, which they did, requesting a continuance, or filing a motion to have this evidence excluded from trial. Despite all of this, the judge gives the FBI agent Alan Brantley the go-ahead to testify, and then tells the defense team that the jury will decide how much weight to give his testimony. So that's where we are right now. The jury is brought into the courtroom, and the questioning begins. The direct examination is begun by Mr. Toby Shook of the prosecution. State your name, please. Alan Brantley. And how are you employed, sir? I am a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And where are you currently assigned? I'm currently assigned to the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crimes, which is part of the Critical Incident Response Group at Quantico, Virginia. How long have you been with the FBI? Approximately 13 and a half years. And what positions have you held with the FBI? Other than being an investigative agent in the field, I have been assigned to the National Center since 1988, and in that position have been responsible for the analysis of violent crimes and the providing of information of lead value to investigators that are confronted with repetitive violent crimes, unusual and particularly vicious types of violent offenses as well. And what is your current position? I am a supervisory special agent, as I have said, but I am also the program manager of the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship in conjunction with the Armed Forces of the United States out of Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. I am also the program manager of the component at the National Center that addresses individuals that threaten and or attempt to use weapons of mass destruction. These are primarily weapons involving nuclear, biological, and chemical threats or entities. What are your duties with your current position with the FBI? Well, I am primarily responsible for supervising others at the National Center in the areas that I have already outlined, and also working a variety of violent offenses, including homicides and threats against others. Tell the jury your educational background. I received a Bachelor's of Arts in 1972 from Appalachian State, sorry if I mispronounced that, State University with an undergraduate degree in psychology. I completed a master's degree in counseling and psychology also at Appalachian State in 1976 after I served a tour as an officer in the Marine Corps. From that point, I did postmaster's work at Appalachian State, also at North Carolina State University and Virginia Tech. And how were you employed prior to joining the Bureau? Prior to my joining the FBI, I was employed as a psychologist in a maximum security prison in the state of North Carolina for about 6 years. What were your duties there? A combination of things, but primarily I evaluated and assessed the inmates in that population, all adult males. I provided evaluations for the court and presenting studies, and also did reviews and analysis of inmate cases for consideration of release back into the community and parole. Okay. Do you have any specialized training? My specialized training while in the FBI is centered on information about violent crime, death investigation, crime scene analysis, forensic pathology, forensic dentistry, almost any type of course that might help us to understand not only the behavior of violent criminals, but some of the things relating to the forensic evidence that they may leave behind as well. Have you served on any faculties? I am on the faculty at the FBI Academy and also an adjunct facility member for the University of Virginia. In what particular areas have you lectured or taught? Primarily on the violent crime scene analysis and the assessment of dangerousness, also criminal psychology. While at the FBI Academy, I taught a course at the National Academy on Applied Criminal Psychology. Also, I taught the new FBI trainees that same course on applied criminal psychology. Have you made presentations in your field? I have. What types? Well, again, centering on violent crime, crime scene analysis, and crime and criminal psychology. And we provide presentations in schools ranging from week-long schools to 1 and 2 hour presentations to law enforcement audiences, attorneys and judges, mental health professionals, academics, students. It's just a very broad range of audiences. And are you a member of any professional organizations? I am. I'm a member of the American Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, also the International Homicide Investigators Association, Harvard Associates in Police Science, and the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. And what is the Criminal Investigative Analysis Program? Well, for the most part, when you talk about criminal investigative analysis or crime scene analysis, we're talking about the analysis of the behavior displayed at a crime scene by an offender. What we look at to determine this assessment is primarily in 3 areas: victimology, in other words, what is it about a particular victim that increases his or her risk of becoming a victim of a violent crime. We also look at investigative reports and police reports, and we also concern ourselves and focus on crime scene photos and information about that crime scene. We believe since all crimes are committed by human beings, that some stage along this crime commission process, there is going to be a display of human behavior that lends itself to analysis, interpretation, and from that analysis, information of lead value that could be provided to investigators, to prosecutors, and to jurors like yourselves to hopefully get a little better understanding of the types of criminal behavior that you are not as likely to encounter in your life experiences as I am to encounter in what I do for a living. Have you personally received case materials to review in regards to a murder that occurred in Rowlett, Texas on June 6th, 1996? I have. Involving Devin and Damon Routier? That's correct. Okay. What materials did you utilize in your review? The materials that I had to review were crime scene photographs, crime scene video, autopsy photographs, autopsy reports, investigative reports or police reports, forensic reports. I saw some aerial photographs. I also looked at medical reports. I looked at some legal or court documents, the affidavits for search warrant and arrest. Considered information that I was able to obtain in consultations with investigators and prosecutors. I also visited 5801 Eagle Drive and did a survey of not only the location of that residence, but also the immediate vicinity. I met with some of the forensic experts and also talked with Dr. Parchman Townsend, one of the medical examiners that did the autopsy on one of the victims. After reviewing all that, were you able to form some opinions about the case? I was. Okay. And what is that opinion? My opinion is that in this particular case and this particular crime scene, that this crime scene had been staged, and in all likelihood, whoever killed both Devin and Damon was someone that they knew and someone that they knew very well. When you say a crime scene is staged, what do you mean? What I mean by staging is that the crime scene had been altered. There had been things that had been moved or things that had been disturbed that you don't ordinarily see disturbed in crime scenes like this. And there are some other things that you would expect to be disturbed that were left alone or left untouched. What is staging? Well, staging is when we see staging, it suggests to us a couple or three things. First and foremost, the reason that the offender will stage crime scenes is to divert attention away from the most logical suspect and or the most logical motive. There are some other occasions when scenes are altered or scenes are staged where there is not necessarily any intent, really, to cover a criminal act, but because of embarrassment to a family who may have discovered a loved one that has committed suicide, they may move some things, take some things away before discovery, again, just to prevent some embarrassment either to themselves or to the deceased. Now, what factors did you use in forming your opinion in this particular case? Well, I looked at some major features, and generally, when we start looking at these kinds of offenses, we try to incorporate as much information as we can. But first and foremost, at least I do, I always ask the question, are there any similar or related events in the area? I'm trying to get an assessment of the crime rate. Is it a high crime rate area or a low crime rate area? Unless I am able to establish that, in this case, I was informed it was a very low crime rate area. As a matter of fact, certainly no other homicides like this, to my knowledge, ever. And the homicides that had occurred had been resolved or had been effectively, ruled one way or the other. Also, what I am trying to do with my assessment of the crime rate, I'm trying to determine risk factors to the victims and risk factors for the offender, which is also very important. I think the vast majority of offenders that I have ever encountered do not want to get caught. So they are going to attempt to commit their crimes in such a way as to prevent that. Well, they're going to take into consideration, for instance, whether there are any witnesses around, for instance. In this particular case, I looked at the location of the home and how it was surrounded by homes on almost every side. I also looked, let me just interrupt you. Did you look at photographs, aerial photographs of the neighborhood? I did. And you also went to that neighborhood yourself. Is that right? That's correct. Mr. Toby Shook says, okay, could I have the witness step down for a moment? Please step down. And the court says, yes, you may step down. And Mr. Shook continues. Let me show you what has been entered into evidence as State's Exhibit 7. Do you recognize this as being one of the aerial photographs? I do. Okay. Is the turning this to the jury so we can all see what is it about the particular neighborhood that you consider as one of the risk, as you call them, risk factors? Is that right? Well, as I suggested, this victim residence is completely surrounded actually by residences on all sides. Certainly, it would increase the observation of others and somebody being detected coming in and out of that area. That is certainly something that I think that most criminals are going to take into consideration. Also, I looked at other factors and considered that the vehicle was in front of the home, suggesting to someone that might have been motivated to burglarize that home that there may be somebody there. Certainly, that is a deterrent. That is a risk factor for burglars that don't want to get caught or don't want anyone else to know what they are up to. Also, was able to learn from investigators and from reports that there were people sleeping downstairs and there were lights on. So there was light emanating from the inside. Someone coming around to the back of the house certainly would have been able to see that there was a light on downstairs. Again, suggesting to an offender motivated to either rob or murder that obviously, from these lights being on, then someone may be down there occupying that space. That is certainly another risk factor. Let me ask you, Agent Brantley, is there anything about the makeup of the neighborhood or the way the streets are constructed that is valuable information to you in regards, again, to the risk factors? Well, you look at neighborhood permeability, and again, you look at people that live right on a major thoroughfare. Certainly, that increases their risk of coming into contact with a variety of people because it is a high trafficked area. But when you consider other areas like a cul-de-sac is a little more secure and people coming back into that location, they need to be going back there and are more likely to be observed or contacted. Plus, if an offender is detected in his intention to flee or escape, then his options for escaping successfully are also more limited when he goes into a development which is surrounded by homes and other obstacles and certain access roads. It doesn't necessarily give them a direct access out to a major thoroughfare and escape. Okay, you can go back to your seat, and the witness goes back to the witness stand, and Mr. Toby Shook continues. Now, Agent Brantley, in regards, you looked at the neighborhood itself and what type of neighborhood it is. Then, do you move in what you call the risk factors? You look at the home itself where the crime occurred? Certainly. And again, I start from a broader, expansive view of the neighborhood and the surrounding area and start moving in and start focusing a little more. Certainly focusing on the alleged point of entry and escape, that window and that cut screen. As you look at that and you look at the outside, you see that once someone has negotiated or gotten beyond that 6 foot fence, then you have some other interesting considerations. I think first and foremost, when you look into that garage, what you are confronting almost immediately is an extremely large animal cage, or what one would surmise was the cage of an animal. I think if you were a stranger and you don't know who lives there or what you are likely to encounter, you may suspect reasonably that there may be a rather large animal or a large dog. And certainly a dog can not only confront the would be offender, but can also alert on the fact that someone is there and cause people to investigate and again identify whoever is trying to gain access. Is that what you call what you're in your analysis called a risk factor? A risk indicator, a risk factor, certainly for the offender, something that would increase his risk. Okay. A person that is going to be trying to get into the house or commit a crime or whatever, right, I would think so. Now, when you are doing this analysis, again, what are you basing this on? What type of training do you have when you are conducting this type of analysis? Well, primarily, in addition to all the education, training, and specialized coursework that I have had, it's just a matter of experience. We work literally hundreds of violent offenses and homicides annually. And so, based on that database or that base of experience, that is primarily what we work from. Okay. So, as far as risk factors, you all are looking at things which would worry, I guess, someone that is going to commit an offense. Exactly. I might also add that in my years of experience in the prison setting, where I interviewed hundreds of violent felons, we also got into these kinds of issues, and I was able to determine their MO and some of their rituals. And then, since that time, since being at the FBI Academy, we have done a number of research projects where we go out into the prisons and we interview offenders that commit violent crimes and homicides. And we ask them these same kinds of questions. What is it that you consider when you are attempting to assault or when you are planning your assault? What is it you consider while you are there committing the actual homicide? And what do you consider what you do post offense once you have exited? And again, based on that body of information and that body of knowledge, we use that to incorporate that into it too. And what you were just saying is at the point of entry at that window, there was some type of animal cage. Is that right? That's correct. And in addition to that, I think on the outside, there are some animal bowls or water and food dishes also that might suggest to someone motivated to break in that there, in all likelihood, is an animal present. Okay, let me show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 40B. Is this a photograph, I guess, on the inside of the large cage that you're talking about? That's correct. This is the type of thing, I guess, someone coming in is going to be a little bit wary of if they see an animal cage. I believe so. Someone not familiar with the area, not knowing what kind of animal might be contained in that size of cage, is reasonably going to be concerned, I would think. Okay. You said you recall bowls of food on the outside patio? That's correct. Okay. For animals? Yes, it's reasonable to assume for, on the part of an offender, that those are animal dishes. Is that another factor that, again, you consider about? Certainly. Okay. You said, I believe, your information was that back patio door, that there was a TV visible from the outside? Light. Okay. What does that, is that another risk factor you consider? Certainly. Again, for the most part, individuals that are motivated, at least to rob or burglarize, they are going to want to go into a residence that no one is home. And when you have all these indicators that someone is there, I think for some, not all certainly, that they are less likely to select that house. Again, victim selection is important to these people. And what they are keeping in mind is risk to themselves. What about the point of entry itself, the cut screen? What did that tell you? In terms of risk, not anything significant, but I think it was unusual in the way that it was cut. In our experience, when we see screens that are cut, and we have seen screens that have been cut before in the commission of an offense, they are generally small cuts that they use to gain access to a lock or a latch or something else that they can throw, and then they will gain entry through a window or through a door. But quite often, they will pull the screen off after they have slit the screen to open the lock. So that is not really a risk factor. That is another, I didn't consider that so much a risk factor. Okay, I might be getting a little more ahead of myself. Let's stick along these risk factors as to the offender. What else about the crime scene in the house do you feel would be a risk factor? I think as you move into the residence, and again, if you are to believe that this is someone that is unfamiliar with the floor plan of the home, and as compressed as it is, and with much as many personal effects that are in that garage, it's a very narrow route. And again, for someone to come in there and negotiate through that area and not knock into something or not knock something over, that is a factor. And again, as you proceed on in, again, if you consider that it was dark up until the time that they got into maybe the utility room or the kitchen, and then the Roman room or the den, that is something that was considered. But I think what becomes more important from the standpoint of risk is that the offender in this particular case, which is very contradictive of my experience, focused on the children, went to the children, assaulted them first. And again, their wounds, the nature and severity of their wounds was significantly different than the wounds of Mrs. Routier. Now, what that suggests to us and what that tells us is very contradictory, is that for the most part, offenders coming into an environment like that encounter victims or potential victims, they generally are attempting to limit their risks by dealing with or dispatching the adult members first. Because again, the adults, especially male adults, would represent the greatest threat or greatest risk. In this case, that was not accomplished. Also, after the kids are stabbed and either dead or dying, and Mrs. Routier is assaulted, here we have an offender who is just, in his own mind, has to believe committed a homicide, a multiple homicide. And then here is a lady that gets up and chases or pursues this individual who has already stabbed two boys, in all likelihood, killed these two boys, and assaulted her and armed with this knife. And then he is chased by this lady who is about 5'2", I understand, certainly not nearly the size that the alleged offender was described to be. And he runs away from her, which again increases his risk because now he has left a living witness, someone that can not only identify him possibly, but also somebody that can sound the alarm and either get her husband to come downstairs or call the police. That also is a major risk factor and a major glaring error in the behavior of criminals that do these kinds of things. And then proceeds on out of the residence, and I think increasing his risk further, because if she continued to pursue, then he throws down this weapon or drops this weapon. So he no longer has that to defend himself or to silence this potential witness, or at least stop her from continuing to pursue him. That also is something that I think increases his risk and something you don't ordinarily see. Okay. When you are making an assessment of a crime scene from your standpoint, are you looking at kind of contradictions or what's wrong with this? Exactly. And that is what we start with. I guess fundamentally is what's wrong with this picture? And what we're looking for are behavioral contradictions and forensic contradictions and things that just don't line up with our experience and what these people have told us in past interviews. Okay. Are there any other risk factors that you took into consideration? Well, I think primarily that was all. But what was interesting and what I did note was that it kind of goes back to the sock that was found. If you are to believe that the offender, after exiting the residence, then proceeds in that direction instead of running away from the development or getting out of the development in the quickest way, he seems to run back into the development again, which might increase his risk of being seen by others or confronted by others. Plus, if he is not familiar with that development and those roads, he could get back in there and get turned around and get lost. And again, he increases his risk of maybe being discovered. Okay. Is that primarily all of the risk factors you were considering then? I believe so. I believe that is it. Okay. Now you have talked about, you are looking at the victimology and that there are high risks or low risks. What do you mean by that? What is victimology? Exactly. Victimology, again, is basically what is it about a particular victim or victims that increases his or her risk of becoming a victim of a violent crime. It's lifestyle kinds of things. It's where they are employed. Who have they angered in the past? Are they having any extramarital affairs or things that might create friction or conflict with others? Do they abuse alcohol or drugs? Those kinds of things, lifestyle questions. When you consider this case and these victims, I think I would classify them as extremely low risk, probably the most low risk victims that there are. So, for a stranger or for someone else motivated for whatever purposes to come into this location and assault or focus on these two young children, that I think goes directly to motive. that they were obviously the focus of the offender's interest and the offender's assault. And this was a very personal style of assault. No indication of robbery. And again, we start trying to assess motive early on. Nothing is taken, certainly. There were an incredible amount of valuables there for the taking. You had no indication of assault anywhere. So you have to look at that personal motive. When we see personal motive, we start considering, well, what represents personal motive? You are talking about anger, revenge, financial gain, talking about maybe somebody with a serious mental disorder, maybe somebody that just wants to eliminate the victims because they represent some kind of an obstacle to a goal. Those are what we consider in personal kinds of assaults or personal motives. You say that children at that age, 5 and 6, almost 7, they are very low risk victims. Why is that? Well, because for the most part, their life experiences, they have got their circle of peers and friends, and they go to school. I mean, they are not involved in a lot of risky kinds of activities that we consider elevates a victim's risk. I mean, they are not going out into high crime rate neighborhoods at night, going to bars, picking up people for one night stands, doing those kinds of things, again, that certainly would elevate one's risk. The method that they were killed, the two children, was that important to you? And compared to the contrast to the injuries that Mrs. Routier received? Well, it's basically what we consider the nature and severity of the trauma was incredibly more significant than Mrs. Routier sustained. Certainly, that is a dramatic difference. Also, to us, represented a major contradiction. Why she was left alone, seemingly left alive, and the kids were killed. Okay. And you believe, from looking at the crime scene and the method of the killing, that the children were the object of the attack? Certainly. There's no question about it. Because again, just the number of wounds, the placement of the wounds, all focused right in the chest area here, almost as if the offender is going for the heart or going for the most vital regions of the body. The depth of the penetration of the wounds certainly suggests anger and force and a focus. When you look at Mrs. Routier's wounds, you see that they are certainly, obviously, avoiding any of the vital areas, but they've been described as superficial. You have here in the shoulder and the forearm, and a scratch here and a cut across the neck. Again, very, very dramatically different from the focus of the wounds that were sustained by the young children. Okay, now you talked about staging and that you believe that this crime scene may have been staged. That's correct. What factors do you look at when you are considering that? Well, in addition to everything we have described, we're looking for things that have been done or manipulated at the scene, things that just don't occur, what we consider naturally. And again, as you proceed on in and we look at what's happened to the children, we look at what else has been done at the scene, what else is either out of place, missing, or has been brought there by the offender. And I think what stands out, what is a stark contrast, is that you have a maximum human devastation and loss here, but an absolute minimum of breakage or property damage. And this is very, very curious to us. It's almost like our offender had no real regard for the children. They just wanted the children eliminated. But yet, when it comes to the protection and preservation of the material items in the home, he was very careful, very cautious not to break anything. Some things were disturbed, but no real breakage other than this wine glass, apparently, and this screen being cut. What stranger motivated to come in there and murder is going to be concerned with the personal possessions of the residents unless it's someone that has a vested interest in preserving those items? That is what we refer to as a proprietary interest. And that also suggests to us that that is someone, obviously, that has got a connection with those items beyond just being there on that particular occasion. So it's not only things that may have been disturbed, but things that showing the lack of things being disturbed. Certainly. And when you consider that you have this violent struggle, the assault and killing of two young children and an adult, you would certainly have expected to see much more in the way of disruption and breakage and damage, and things turned over, and evidence, just evidence that someone else was there, other than the people that lived there. What kinds of things did you consider when coming to that opinion? There in the room itself. Well, I started to focus on some major features, again, not wanting to overanalyze or reach, but I looked at the lampshade that was off of the lamp. I looked at the coffee table and the flower arrangement that was on the coffee table. It was also it was turned over. I also looked at the other items in that room, and certainly the glass tabletops and the other decorative items that were on top of these glass tables. Certainly, when you look at a room or that den, the Roman room, I guess it's called, it's very compressed. It's a very small area. And for two adults to be in there fighting and struggling with one another, you would have expected to see some more dislodged. Of course, then you proceed on out of that room and you get into the kitchen area where the wine rack and the glass was broken. There's some things about the wine rack that certainly seem to be contradictions. You also look at the vacuum cleaner and the position of the vacuum cleaner and the bloody footprints that are found or discovered underneath the vacuum cleaner. Again, very, very curious from our perspective. Also, the way the cord is seemingly stacked or placed underneath the base of the vacuum cleaner, it certainly indicates or suggests that this is not something that has been thrown or knocked over in the struggle, but something that has been deliberately placed there and then turned over. Then again, you go further if you are to assume that the avenue of escape for the offender is through the utility room and out the garage, and then out that cut screen, you look for any other disruption. You look for blood, transfer of blood, or any sign that someone else has been through there. That has just been engaged in a violent struggle, and there is none of that. You look for disruption in the yard, the flower bed, and the mulch. Any sign of blood, or of fingerprints, or any other scuffs, or tears, or material items on the fence, the gate, nothing. Again, also very, very curious. Okay, let's kind of start, I guess, in the room itself. Well, let's look at the bottom right hand corner here. These are rather large here on States Exhibits 35A. Is this what you are talking about? About the glass table and the, I guess, the flower arrangement that is knocked over there? Yes, it is. Why is that important to you again? Well, again, not only that it's there and it's disrupted, but the severity of the disruption. Again, it's just kind of pushed to the side, this very light based paper mache vessel, and then these dried flowers and things, which is very light. It's just kind of tipped over. It's not knocked off at all. And there is nothing broken. None of these stems or these leaves or anything are really out of place. Again, somebody hitting into that during the course of a violent struggle, you would have anticipated more disruption. What about this glass coffee table that it rests upon? Well, I think it shows, maybe not in this photo, maybe clearer in another one, but that was somewhat askewed. Yes. Does that enter into your indications anyway? Here it is in States Exhibits 47A and 47B. Well, it's moved, and again, but not dramatically so. Again, when you ask what's wrong with this picture, I mean, there are signs, indications that there has been a tremendous struggle here and a homicide. Or is it something other than that? Okay. You also mentioned a lampshade that had been knocked off at the top of the lamp. Certainly, the lampshade was down over the, I guess, the pillar there of the lamp. But as they examined the lamp base has not been moved at all. So it looks like this has been hit and the lampshade falls, but no destruction whatsoever. Now, I understand that there was no clasp or no screw at the top of this lampshade to hold that in place. So it was just kind of balanced. So it wouldn't take a lot of force or a lot of energy, at least, to knock that lampshade down. And again, it appears that this is exactly what happened. Not a lot of force or energy taken to cause that lampshade to come down. You described, I believe, you referred to it as the Roman room. That is what some people call it. Is that right? That's correct. The area where the murders occurred? Yes, sir. Were there a lot of items that could be broken in there? Certainly, especially I guess, the sofa table behind one of these sofas there. There were quite a few items on that table that were all in place. And again, nothing broken or damaged. Okay. Again, the sofa table. Are we talking about? Could I have the witness step down for just a moment? And the court says, please step down. The witness then steps down and says, this table right here with the statuette and the candles and all of the other decorative items in the photograph. And when you compare that with the activity here in front of this couch, and if you believe from the statements that the offender then encounters Mrs. Routier and exits or leaves the area, he comes from this area, which is very, very narrow. There are two tables there. There is a table here with a flower arrangement and some diapers. And then there is this table for an adult male to go through here, especially at a high rate of speed and not to have touched or knocked into any of that. It seems again strange. However, someone could have gone through there without knocking any of those items. But in doing so, again, someone would have to be careful not to do that. Again, what stranger who has just killed two children and assaulted an adult is going to be worried about going through that area very carefully? And then you mentioned, I believe, the wine rack. Is that right? That's correct. And what is it specifically that you noted about the wine rack? Well, again, the contradictions. The wine glass was knocked off and broken, and there is a decanter that is knocked over on its side, and the wine bottle is laying on its side. But there are other items there that are more fragile, and I think lighter items that were not disturbed. Okay. If we can hold the exhibit up for the members of the jury to see, the court says, can all members of the jury see that? And the jury says, yes, sir. The court says, make sure you can see. All right, thank you. Mr. Schuck then continues, looking here at 36D and the photographs here in the upper right of the line, is that the wine rack you are talking about? This is exactly what I'm talking about here. You see the glass broken here on the floor and the decanter here that is on its side. But there are some very small glasses up here that are seemingly undisturbed. You have one wine bottle here leaning in that direction. But what is interesting, and what I believe is a contradiction, is you have got this ice bucket and you have got some utensils that go along with that ice bucket that are in place and not disturbed. Especially down here, you have a corkscrew item and you have a can opener and a bottle opener and some other device that is carelessly balanced on this corkscrew. And they are still sitting there very symmetrical. You also have two glasses on either side of this ice bucket, and they also are very symmetrically placed. And it looks like they haven't been disturbed at all. So if you are to believe someone hits into this wine rack with enough force to cause this wine glass to come up over that obvious holder or lip, which is almost like I guess, a U shape, then why wasn't there enough force applied to dislodge some of these other items? Contradiction. Okay. You mentioned the vacuum cleaner and that we see here at the bottom of the exhibit lying there on the floor. Certainly. You look at this vacuum cleaner and you look at how it's positioned. You notice and you understand that there are bloody footprints underneath. Certainly, the bloody footprints were there before the vacuum cleaner was overturned. It takes no behavioral scientist or no rocket scientist to come in here and talk about those kinds of things. You also have a significant amount of blood up here on the handle, indicating or suggesting that someone grabbed this, transferred that blood and placed it over. I looked at the position of the cord, and this doesn't depict it as accurately as some other photos that I have seen, but you can see that the cord is kind of piled up or stacked underneath the base of this vacuum cleaner. If someone had grabbed this and thrown it in an attempt to create an obstacle for someone pursuing or for any other reason, you would have expected that cord to be in a different position. Okay, go ahead and have a seat, Agent Brantley. And the witness then goes back to the witness stand, and Mr. Shook continues. Were there any other areas in the house that you were looking at as far as this staging that was important to you in your analysis? Well, as you come out past the kitchen and you go to the utility room, and I think what's noted is there was blood droplets leading up and into that utility room, and they just cease. They stop. And there is no other indication beyond that, at least on escape, that anyone has gone through there, that anyone has disturbed any dust or dirt on the windowsill, that there has been a transfer of blood in the garage, and that there has been a transfer to the outside in the backyard, the mulch or anything else has been disturbed, or that there has been anything touching or disturbing the fence or the gate. Okay. Now, you have looked at some forensic reports involving a bread knife that was in the residence that had some material on it. Is that right? That's correct. Okay. Did that form any part of your analysis? Certainly. That is something else that is obvious major contradiction. If you are to believe that the offender gains access and how an offender gains access to a residence is very important to us. How does this offender gain access? If you are to believe that the offender cuts the screen with that particular knife that has microscopic evidence of rubber particles and glass particles, then that's extremely curious. Why would an offender break into a home or gain access to this home and then take that knife and then go back outside and cut the screen to come back in? That is ludicrous. And certainly, if the offender is already there and he gets this knife and he is using that to escape, we have seen no cases where an offender breaks out of a residence like that, where they come through and then cut the screen and then go out. And then they go back and replace the knife into the butcher block before they run through it. Again, that is very contradictory and very unusual. But beyond that, you look at this knife that was used to cut the screen, and then after the cutting of the screen, that knife is replaced, and then the offender takes another knife out of this butcher block to use as the murder weapon. Why so much variation? Why are you taking one knife, using it for that purpose, having the time and the forethought to put that back and then use another knife? Something else that is interesting to us from the standpoint of stranger versus someone who may not be a stranger, and that is the proprietary interest I described earlier. We all have patterns of relating to our environment and patterns of doing things. For instance, people go and they take knives from a certain location, they use that knife, and they replace that knife right back into its rightful position or place. What stranger is going to take a knife and use it and then go back and be concerned about replacing it in its rightful position? Again, this is suggestive of someone that is used to doing that, and this is just part of their pattern, because a stranger is not going to have any concern for that. They can throw the knife down, as they did with the other knife, leave it on the countertop, throw it in the garage, take it with them because he may know that this weapon, certainly the knives or anything he touched, it is obvious that it has an obvious evidentiary value. And most offenders are cognizant or aware of that fact, and they don't want to leave that behind for the police to discover or use in a court of law. Going back to, from your analysis, it looks as if the children were the object of the attack. Yes. Did the fact that a knife, the butcher knife, a kitchen knife from the home, is used to do the killing, is that significant to you? It is. And again, weapon selection is important. And another feature that we consider. In our experience, most offenders that go to a residence and commit a homicide, They're going to take a weapon with them, something that they are comfortable with, something that they can use to commit the homicide, or another weapon. Take a gun, a ligature. The fact that nothing apparently was taken to the scene, but the offender goes to the scene, obtains a weapon there, uses that weapon, and then leaves it behind is important. Okay, let's take the bread knife out of the picture for a moment. The knife that had the microscopic characteristics consistent with the screen. Certainly. Okay, does that change your opinion in any way? No. And why is that? Well, because that is just one feature. There are many other features that we took into consideration. And what we look at when we do our assessment and our analysis is not one individual feature or behavior. It's the totality of the circumstances. And an awful lot of these kinds of features are interrelated. They are tied to one another. So you can't really look at one in isolation and determine anything. Okay. Again, you looked at possible motives from an outside party coming in. Robbery, in this case. Were you aware of, well, I guess it was various items left around in the residence? Is that right? That's correct. Okay. Do you remember what types of items we're talking about? Well, primarily the jewelry, the large amount of jewelry that was left there in plain view. And certainly, this also seemed to be in this path of entry and escape. And so, I mean, it was right there for the taking. And all someone had to do was just reach over and grab it. Also, you looked at the purses that were in the area and whether they were disturbed or whether anyone was attempting to steal money, cash, or credit cards. And there is no indication that anything like that has occurred. As a matter of fact, nothing was disturbed. Nothing of value in that home seemed to be of interest whatsoever to the offender in this case. Okay, well, I may not confine it, but are you talking about on the island there was various rings left? That's correct. And on the tabletop, I mean? Yes, sir. And also a watch in the kitchen left on the island there? That's correct. Okay. Now we talked about another motive for maybe going in the house is assault. Well, offenders go in, and you have studied, I guess, guys that go in, yes, sir, go into the homes to assault women. Yes. Do they do that when children are present? Yes, that is a common practice, as a matter of fact. For a to go in, either they are going to primarily select a female alone in the residence or a female with young children. And the reason they select females with young children is that they can use the threat of violence directed against these children as a way to control the female victim. For instance, if you just do what I tell you and you give me what I want, I'll leave your children alone. But if you don't, I'll hurt the children. So that is a very effective control maneuver that they will implement. Looking at it from a standpoint of perhaps maybe this was a party coming in to sexually assault Mrs. Routier, the killing of the children, was that a contradiction from what you are used to seeing? It is a major contradiction in that behavior and that belief on their part because, again, they want those children alive. It's the threat of the harm that they use to control the victim. If they have already stabbed and hurt the children and killed the children, they can forget about any cooperation on the part of that female victim then. That victim is much more inclined to fight for their life. Has that then, from what you have seen, if someone starts harming a mother's children, what is going to happen? Well, it depends on that relationship that the mother has with the children. But most of the mothers that I have known, and I have talked to quite a few surviving mothers that have lost their children, when they have the opportunity, they are going to fight you. And they are going to fight not only their lives, but the lives of their children. That is just a natural reaction. Yes, in my experience, that is what they described. Now, you have been doing this type of crime scene analysis for how long? Well, I have been assigned to the unit there since 1988. Okay. And when is the first time you talked to our office in regards to this case? I believe this was the 19th of June of 1996. Okay. And then you have come to Dallas and talked with some of the prosecutors. Is that right? That's correct. How many times have you come to Dallas? Besides this time, there was one other time, and that was in October of 1996. Okay. And then how long were you in Dallas on that particular occasion? The first time, I believe it was 2 or 3 days. Okay. You said you went out to you didn't on that occasion, you didn't go into the residence itself, did you? No, I did not go into the residence. That's correct. Okay. Just outside the residence? That's correct. Okay. And then, of course, you have spoken on the phone with me numerous times. That's correct. Okay. You have been doing this analysis since you say 1988? 1988, I was assigned to that unit. However, I was one of our field coordinators before that and was involved in some training and some work with the unit before I was actually assigned there. Okay. And you assist on a daily basis. Do these things come into your office? Oh, certainly. Okay. We literally provide services to legitimate law enforcement agencies, not only nationally, but from around the world. I have just gotten back from a trip to Israel and provided training to the Israeli National Police on violent crime scene analysis so that we get quite a few requests. Okay. So you don't just concentrate on crimes here in the nation, you do it worldwide also? The vast majority of cases are obviously from this nation, but we do take some international cases as well. Okay. And this analysis that you do is usually with law enforcement officials? Law enforcement officials and prosecutors. That's correct. Okay. And the opinions you are basing these on is your experience and training and everything you have seen throughout the years? Certainly. Mr. Toby Shook says, just one moment, Judge. And the court says, okay. And Mr. Shook says, Judge, that's all of the questions I have at this time. And the court says, all right. And then at this point, they do a recess. And that is where we are going to stop for this episode as well. All right. So let's recap what we've learned. When the prosecution begins to question Mr. Brantley, we first hear his background, what he currently does, where he's been educated, what his responsibilities are. And I want to put this into some kind of perspective for just a moment. This trial is happening in Kerrville, Texas. At the time of the trial, the population of Kerrville was under 20,000 people, so a pretty small place. The jury was likely pulled from this group of 20,000 people who, likely in their lifetime, has never ever seen or even been in close proximity to an FBI agent. Most of us haven't, at least to our knowledge, right? So, and I'm just assuming here that this jury is super impressed that an FBI agent with his background that he has is testifying in this case. When I first listened to his testimony about his background and such, my first thought, though, was why was someone who had such large responsibilities, such as threats against our country, major crime scenes, I'm thinking serial killers and the like, and someone who has his background, why would someone like this be testifying in a case in Kerrville, Texas? Is it an important case? Absolutely. But there are cases like this all across the country on any given day. Very sadly. Why this case? These are just my thoughts. As I'm editing the prosecution side of things, I'm sure I'll have many, many other questions as the defense takes over. So, right out of the gate, Mr. Brantley talks about what he reviewed about this case and then is asked his opinion. And this is right out of the gate. I'm kind of surprised that the defense didn't object to this. But again, I'm not a lawyer. This is just my average run of the mill person's question. When he does give his opinion, he says that he believes the crime scene was staged and that whomever killed the boys was someone that they knew and someone that they knew very well. He leaves it kind of open. He doesn't accuse Darlie directly, but obviously, since she's the one on trial, all of the jury's eyes are looking at her. When he explains why he believes the crime scene was staged, He mentions that it appears the crime scene had been altered and things that had been moved or disturbed that you wouldn't normally see in a crime scene. But we do know that when the original investigation was taking place, the police department wasn't exactly familiar with this type of crime scene, right? And they didn't exactly do things by the book, or maybe they meant to, but instead of calling in a team that would have been more familiar with something like this, they tried to handle it on their own. What did seem very interesting to me, though, and this kind of made me do a double take, was what he said when he talked about the things that were not disturbed. And we'll get into that in a little bit. I did find it interesting. I don't know if you noticed this too, how Alan Brantley, just like James Cron, is very, very wordy. He's asked questions. He doesn't give a straightforward answer. He gives a very long and lengthy answer. So much so that even at one point, the prosecutor had to interrupt him because he had gone on for so long and said, okay, next, I'm going to ask you this next question or something to that regard. Mr. Brantley also explains that because the house was surrounded by other houses, it would increase the chances of someone seeing the would be burglar. Now, this may or may not be true because evidently this crime, or it did, happen at 2:30, 2:15, something like that in the morning. So it's highly doubtful anybody's out milling around in the neighborhood. He also said that a car was in front of the house, one of the Routier's vehicles, and there was also light coming from the room where Darlie and the boys were at. He says that all of these things are deterrents to committing a burglary. He also talks about how if someone were to break in who maybe did not know the inside of the Routier home, that where this screen would cut, they would first see this animal cage, which might deter them not knowing what kind of animal might have been in that cage. And here he does make a really good point. He also makes a point that in cases that he has seen where a screen has been cut, the offender usually makes a small cut to gain access to the latch that can open the window. But the more I think about this, though, the screen is on the outside of the window, obviously. Even if you cut a small notch in the screen, how would you gain access to the latch? The latch of the window is likely on the inside of the glass portion of the window. You'd have to break the glass, right? So that kind of struck me as a little weird. And if the window is already open and it's just a screen, there's no reason to try and get to this latch anyway. All you have to do is cut open the screen or pull off the window screen. So this argument doesn't really sit very well with me. Mr. Brantley also mentions that the kids were harmed first, which is not what a typical burglar would do. They would first try to get rid of the greatest threat, which would be the adult in the room. But we've learned that at least where the blood was located, that Darlie had to have been bleeding while she was near the children, which indicates that she was in fact harmed first. But again, and I'm sure we'll get into this when the defense gets their turn to question Mr. Brantley, but it really kind of depends on the timing, right? The timing of when did the boys get hurt? When did Darlie get hurt? When did, there's you could run through a whole series of theories about this. Mr. Brantley also says that she did not suffer the same types of wounds as the boys, which is absolutely true. But to me, and this is something that has always kind of sat in the back of my mind ever since I started covering this case, was the reason that her injuries were not the same was because whoever created them just couldn't bring themselves to do it. Now, Mr. Brantley, he firmly believes that the children were the focus of the crime, not Darlie. And he also does make another really good point that based on the devastation that occurred inside the house, at least regarding the loss of life and so forth, as well as a struggle, that there was limited damage to all of the things in the house. If this was a stranger who did not know their way around, they would have been knocking into things, knocking them over, etc. He also mentions the bloody footprints underneath the vacuum cleaner, but I kind of take this with a grain of salt because I believe that some of these things, maybe even the vacuum, were moved before the crime scene photos were taken. Yes, there was a bloody handprint on the handle, but this doesn't mean that that vacuum was moved at the same time that the handprint was placed on the handle. He also gives us his determination of this wine rack, how some things were just balanced there and did not seem to be disturbed. And the blood in the utility room, how the blood droplets just seemed to stop before even getting to the garage area. Now, if we are to believe that it was the bread knife that was used to cut the screen, and then another knife from the butcher block was used in the commission of the crime, he makes a really good point. Who's going to take the time to replace the knife back into that butcher block? If someone was concerned about getting caught, they wouldn't put it back into the butcher block. At the end of his testimony with the prosecution, we learned that he, Mr. Brantley, works with police agencies and prosecutors to give these kinds of assessments. And this is where the prosecution ends their questioning. All in all, this has been some pretty, honestly, damning testimony. And I'll be curious to see how the defense handles it from here. I do want to point out something, however, that this whole time that the prosecutor is questioning Mr. Brantley on the stand, he never directly mentions Darlie. He implies that it was someone who was close to the family and someone who obviously knew their way around the home. And various times, he even says he, not she. And that'll do it for this episode. In the next episode, we start hearing from the defense, which likely is going to run a very long time. So it'll probably be at least over a couple of episodes. With that said, thank you. Thank you all for listening. You are also truly, truly appreciated. Please make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world. It really does. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's case, or on today's episode at least. So drop your comments on my YouTube podcast page, where I often interact with listeners and respond to comments. So with all of that said, I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.